Horus Heresy Legions is a big game. It has lots of factions with lots of cards and lots of different playstyles. However, sometimes certain kinds of cards and strategies just fail to deliver. In this series, I'm going to be going over some of them. I'm going to be talking about what they are supposed to do, why they fail at doing so, and how to improve them. If you want to see more of this, subscribe and leave a like so I know you guys enjoy this content. Now, let's get into today's topic. Today, our topic is not bound to a single faction in the game. In fact, it is not even bound to a single expansion in the game. Today's topic can be found across multiple factions and multiple expansions, and has in fact existed since the very first second of this game's lifespan, and it still exists today. Today, I want to talk about Tempo Loss cards. So, what do Eightfold Brand, Eternal Vigilance, and Mantle of Ultramar all have in common? They are all 5 energy Tempo Loss tactics. Today, I will go over what these kinds of cards are, why they are bad, and which ones are actually good, and how do you need to build your deck to use them. So, first of all, to explain what Tempo Loss tactics means, you obviously have to explain what tempo means. And tempo is a term that refers to the board state. A high tempo means lots of units on your board, and the low tempo means less units on the board. Therefore, Tempo Loss cards are cards that have no immediate impact on the entire board. For example, Eternal Vigilance simply gives your warlord a passive heal 1, which in itself does not really impact the board state immediately. Most of these cards can be divided into one of these 3 categories. They are either card or value generators, like Eightfold Brand, they are board buffers, like Mantle of Ultramar, or they are warlord-related equipment, like Eternal Vigilance. So, what do these 3 terms actually mean? Card generators are usually tactics that generate 1 troop every turn in your hand. This type of card has been present in the neutral card pool for a very long time. It started in the second expansion Istvan V with the Forge Complex for Mechanicum, and has since been expanded into the Chaos card pool with the Eightfold Brand, which generates cultists, and into the Imperial Army card pool in the latest expansion, or one of the latest expansions I should say, with the Administration Complex for Traitor Auxilia. Board buffers are tactics that buff your entire board or certain types of your units automatically, either when a certain condition is fulfilled or at the end of your turn, at the start of your turn. This includes cards like Death of Innocence, which buffs Mechanicum troops when they are put on the board, or Lupercal's Ambition, which buffs troops by +1 attack and +1 health when they receive a Mark of Chaos. Lastly, Warlord equipment is usually some kind of weapon that increases your Warlord stats in some way. The best example are cards like Bileblade, which simply give your Warlord 1 point of attack, as well as some useful traits like Poisonous 1. They've also been a thing since the very first set, thanks to the World Eaters, which had the cards Gore Child and Gore Father, which gave your Warlord Cleave 2, and the other card gave your Warlord +1 attack. So, why are these cards bad? Let's start with the card generators. Overall, the concept of card generators is a slow but infinite generation of value, which at first glance seems pretty strong. You essentially never run out of troops to play in your late game, so you will eventually win by sheer amount of numbers. Sadly, this concept doesn't really work out in practice. For one, most of these cards are simply too random. You often get bad cards from them or cards that are simply not good in your current situation. Second of all, the initial cost of playing these cards usually means you skip an entire turn in the mid-game or a large portion of your turn in the endgame without putting anything on the board or using any cards to remove something from your opponent's board. Lastly, the game has simply become way too fast for these cards. The aforementioned skipped turn in the mid-game is often the turn that will lose you the game if you play these cards, since you simply skip your entire turn, do nothing, and then most modern decks will be able to set up lethal on you either in the next turn or on the turn that follows. These kinds of cards can still work if your opponent doesn't have anything to set up lethal or simply has no cards on the board. However, this scenario is often a scenario which you actually want to achieve, so you can set up lethal yourselves. And most decks will have any sort of way to exploit this further than to simply set up an infinite value generation to win at some point in the near future, when they can simply win in the next turn and the turn that follows. Next up, board buffers. At first glance, a card like Death of Innocence seems amazing for a Warlord like Tacitus Proctor. You play this card, and then afterwards, every time you use your ability, your troops get bigger. This is an argument that I hear a lot from newer players, so let me use this as an example and explain why Death of Innocence is actually not a very good card for Tacitus Proctor. It is in fact a very bad card for Tacitus Proctor. So to start off, Tacitus Proctor is a Swarm Warlord. He wants lots of troops on his side of the board at all times, since his passive ability buffs all of these troops automatically. Death of Innocence is a card that will need you to skip a turn, either your 4-5 energy turn or a big portion of any following turn, just like the infinite value generators that generate cards in your hand. So, Death of Innocence in itself is fundamentally against Proctor's general game plan. Proctor wants to put troops on the board every turn, so he can buff them at the start of his turn with his Relentless ability. He does not want to skip an entire turn in the mid to late game to set up a card like Death of Innocence that will make his small troops slightly bigger. In fact, he cannot afford to do so. This is essentially the reasoning against every kind of board buff card in the entire game. You can play Lupercal's Ambition in Horus Lupercal, of course. You have your future troops that you use your ability on become bigger, but why should you? You can simply generate value the same turn by playing a troop and buffing it with your wallet, or simply play a troop without anything else. You will gain stats in that turn, and you do not need to set up anything to gain stats passively over the next couple of turns. Lastly, the Warlord equipment. This is the only kind of tempo loss cards that actually has an argument for them to be played, but only in a certain kind of decks. Most modern decks focus on troops. Therefore, wasting energy to invest into a slight increase of your Warlord stat is essentially useless. However, if your focus is on the Warlord and you build your deck primarily around your Warlord, this kind of card suddenly becomes good. This is the so-called Gym-Boss archetype, or Solo Warlord archetype, and it focuses on turning your Warlord into an unstoppable killing machine that wins the game on its own. The best current example of this is Jagathai Khan. You can build Jagathai Khan very Warlord focused, using cards like Skilled Rider to allow him to wipe the entire enemy board, thanks to being able to act again on Battle Honor. This is where the card White Tiger Dao comes into play. White Tiger Dao is a 5 energy tactic that gives your Warlord +2 attack during your turn. Now, for every troop focused deck this is useless, because you waste 5 energy for 2 damage on your turn, when you could instead just be playing a bunch of jet bikes to deal lots of damage in that turn instead of just 2. However, for this kind of build of Jagathai Khan, White Tiger Dao is perfect. It makes it a lot easier to abuse the card Skilled Rider and wipe the entire enemy board, and since you're not really playing troops in the first place, you don't really care about wasting 5 energy worth of tempo, since you weren't really going for tempo in the first place. So overall, some Warlord equipment, like White Tiger Dao, can be very good in the right decks. However, unless you build specifically around your Warlord, you're better off not using any of these cards. So, how could we improve these cards? In general, it's not really the fault of these cards that they are unplayable. The game itself has simply evolved in a way that turns most of them obsolete. Gym-Boss decks, for the Warlord equipment for example, have become way less common due to some very strong counter decks to them, like Mortarion or the now rotated Flame Master Mordred. So let's go over each of these cards and discuss some potential improvement. First up, card generators. These kinds of cards are tough to balance in my opinion. Making them too cheap turns it into an unfun grind against them. You will lose in the end because your opponent just spams troops, and at some point, unless you have some kind of value generation yourself, you're not going to be able to deal with them. The best example of this is actually the Ultramarines mission, which puts in play a 3 attack 4 HP troop at the end of your turn after you played a number of Ultramarine Astartes. Overall, the best way to fix card generators in my opinion is to make them generate something the turn you play them, and potentially also give a slight cost reduction to everything you generate, but still add the card to your hand and not put them directly into play. For board buffers, honestly, they should just delete these kinds of cards. They are fundamentally flawed, since they support swarm strategies, but those strategies cannot really afford to play these cards, so unless they make board buffers incredibly cheap, they will not be played at all, And if they make them incredibly cheap, they also need to tone them down a lot in a way that they are not broken. But at that point, most swarm decks will probably just be better off simply playing more troops to swarm with. Lastly, Warlord equipment. In my opinion, these cards are in exactly the place they should be. They are good for Warlord focused decks and bad for most other decks. Maybe it would be nice for most of them to be a lot cheaper, but with a lot less drastic effects, and overall a more supportive role in general than just give attack to your Warlord. So instead maybe be something like your troops have more HP or anything else really. So as a conclusion, you should not be running tempo loss cards in your decks. I've seen a lot of people do so regardless, and I still see people run cards like Death of Innocence and Proctor, and I still see people recommend running cards like Death of Innocence and Proctor. Just don't. I know there are some cards that look very good and potentially busted in some kinds of decks, and to this day there are still people that want me to believe that One with Death is a good card for every Death Guard deck. It just isn't. Just don't play this card. You are wasting way too much, and especially after the nerfs to cards like Succumb to Decay and such, where you now actually cannot really play them together with manual triggers, just as an example, it's simply not worth the initial setup. Just believe me. I think I know what I'm talking about. So overall, these are an overall issue that can be found in lots of factions, and I think at least the Warlord weapon part is something that every faction gets nowadays, like Sons of Horus got Worldbreaker, the Emperor's Children got the Blade of the Lair, the Death Guard got Harbinger of Decay, and so on and so on. Overall, most of these cards are simply useless, don't play them unless you're playing like Gym-Boss focused, but most of the modern factions are very tempo focused, so these cards are useless. Don't play them.